There is absolutely reason to be concerned that this is a crisis that's going to be exploited by venture capital, by tech capital.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us, a podcast that wonders how Apple is going to keep saying that it promotes privacy when it's installing a COVID-19 tracking app on everyone's phone. I'm your host, Marx, and today I'm speaking with James Wilt. James is the author of Do Androids Dream of Electric Cars? Public Transit in the Age of Uber, Google, and Elon Musk. He's also written for Canadian Dimension, Briarpatch, and Passage, as well as many other publications. You can follow James on Twitter at James_M_Wilt. In today's conversation, we talk about how technology probably won't solve all of our transportation problems if we still keep relying on automobiles, and why instead we need much more of a focus on transit and alternatives to cars. Tech Won't Save Us is a new podcast, so if you enjoy what you hear, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you listen to podcasts and leave a review so more people can find us. And obviously feel free to share this interview because it not only helps us, but it also helps James and the other guests who come on the show to promote their books and everything that they're doing. So thanks so much and enjoy the conversation. James Wilt, welcome to Tech Won't Save Us. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me, Paris.
Thank you. So I want to start, obviously we're in this really unique time with COVID-19 spreading around the world, and we're shutting stuff down to try to ensure it doesn't spread and to flatten that curve. And in response, like your book focuses on transit and transportation. So we're seeing some transit agencies eliminating fares, other transit agencies cutting back on service. And obviously bus drivers feel particularly at risk in many cities because their passengers can come on and they can catch the virus that way. So what's your kind of response to what you're seeing cities doing and transit agencies doing in response to COVID-19 that's maybe positive or negative? And what does that suggest for maybe future campaigns to make transit free, expand transit services, things like that?
Yeah, you're right that there has been a really wide range of responses to this. Like in a number of cities across Canada, which is what I pay most attention to, they have made they've just got rid of fares because they don't want riders to have to interact with the bus drivers in front of the bus, and so they're doing rear door boarding, which is interesting because I mean it's something that a lot of fare-free advocates have pushed for a long time, but I definitely don't think they saw it kind of emerging this way within this context. So that's one way. Another way that we've seen in places like Toronto is vastly increased sort of fare enforcement. Is that this is a trend that's been happening for a long time, that rather than working to improve service by increasing frequency of service and also reducing or abolishing fares, some cities have gone in kind of the opposite direction as service sort of flatlines or actually decreases as represented by ridership or coverage or that kind of thing. They've increased the number of fare enforcement officers, and so this disproportionately impacts, of course, Black and Indigenous people and people in low-income communities, and so we've seen some of that. But in terms of like looking forward, not not to say that my book has it all or that the answer is just confirmed through this, but I do think that there is like a kernel of truth in the sense that the way that I laid it out in my book was, and this is talking to many experts from across North America about transit, including yourself, is that the answer to flatlining or declining transit ridership is improving service, and so that means putting more buses on the road, more trains on the road, increasing the frequency at which they come. So if you miss a bus or a train, you can be guaranteed another one. You don't have to worry that you're going to show up late to your job or your appointment or whatnot. And also reducing fares to make it more equitable and affordable and something that people are going to tend towards, which we've seen numerous examples of around the world, and just make it a more comfortable experience. So things like heated or air-conditioned shelters, lots of public washrooms, making it fully accessible for people with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the things I kind of lay out in my book. And watching COVID unfold, it's like these remain the exact things that have to happen. Is that in order to guarantee social distancing, you need to put more buses on the road. You need to make it more. You need to give greater ability for people to be able to hop on a bus while preventing overcrowding. And overcrowding is linked to a bunch of other issues too, including harassment and assault of women, non-binary, trans people on transit. And so this is something that advocates have been pointing out for a very long time: is that you do not want overcrowding, because that can allow people to engage in those kind of hostilities towards people and then kind of get away with it. And so once again, we see that the response is not to abandon transit and just say, well, we have to cut service because we're not getting enough fare revenue, because that just puts the people who rely on transit, the so-called captive riders, which I think is a kind of a problematic concept to begin with. But that's how many transit agencies do frame it. That they just have to live with what the city can pretend to afford to provide. And so I think moving forward, you know, keeping fares abolished, I think, is a great step. We've seen really radical successes, in places like Dunkirk, France, which saw a massive spike in ridership, and a full 50% of that came from people who had previously driven, right? So, in terms of getting cars off the road and people onto buses, that's a super great step. And also, it does protect drivers. So in the case of COVID, the key concern is, operators will get coughed on, sneezed on, these kind of things. And there's been a string of incidents where this has happened intentionally, and that's a real huge issue in itself. But even just accidental, the risk of an operator being exposed to this, and we have seen transit operators die as a result after warning that this exact thing will happen. Is that minimizing the amount of interaction between the operator and the riders through fare-free transit, and also all-door boarding, so if people can enter it at the back or the midsection of the bus. Yeah, and once again, just improving the transit experience for everyone is like a great step to ensuring that people can continue to provide the truly essential work that is required during this crisis. So a lot of that is low-wage workers, and a lot of those low-wage workers will be working hours which are not 9 to 5. And so this is something that many cities have traditionally neglected, is that they'll provide decent transit service through the 9 to 5 commuting window. But then if you work, or if you need to grocery shop, or if you need to pick up your kid from childcare, anytime, but after or before that, the transit service can often kind of neglect you. And so really, really working to improve that. And ultimately what that means is, through the abolishing of fares, that this revenue comes from general revenue. And so a government will fund it like they fund a healthcare service in Canada. I mean, that's kind of a complex example in itself, but the idea that we treat public transit as a public service, and it is thus funded publicly, as opposed to through fares, which are ultimately user fees and are often very regressive, even with low income passes. And so I think all of that is to say that what I tried to outline in the book, that we need greatly increased funding. We need to prioritize transit vehicles over automobiles on the streets is also very necessary, and improving the experience for transit riders, who, as transit advocates often point out, have to start as a pedestrian or a cyclist in order to get to the transit stop in the first place. So all these things remain true. A lot of cities will look at this and be like, this is the time we have to administer further austerity. But what that's going to do is just create this vicious cycle that many transit agencies are not going to survive, or if they are going to survive, they're going to come out with very, very weakened service. And so this is once again just a time to really, really commit to a radical improvement in transit service, which protects everyone involved: the riders, the operators, all the other transit workers who show up every single day and put themselves at risk, which is ultimately the result of lack of funding and lack of support from government.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because like the fundamentals of what we need for great transit doesn't change just
Right.
because there's a virus going around now, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really highlights, it even further highlights that those are the things that we need in order to improve transportation in our cities. And I think that one of the real benefits of your book is that you really focus on vulnerable people, on minorities, on the people who often are not included in the conversation around transportation in cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you talk about the captive riders. I saw Jarrett Walker write recently about transit dependent people and
Hmm.
how now these people are often some of the only people left on transit services. And
Absolutely.
in many cities, the services have been cut. So it's more difficult for them to get to their jobs when those are the very people who are keeping our society running right now, who are keeping us
Hmm.
fed, who are ensuring we can get from place to place, who ensure that we get our packages from the great evil Amazon and anywhere
Yeah.
else, right?
Yeah.
But like these people who commonly we so easily kind of denigrate as low wage workers, as
Hmm.
people who are just getting subsidized on transit because they can't afford a car,
Right. Right.
who have no skills and thus don't really contribute anything to our society and so don't deserve to be paid very much and all these sorts of things. Like it's kind of being flipped on its head, and it's being proven that the job creators are not really the value creators or the people who are
Hmm.
really dependent on. It's the people at the very bottom who are often treated really terribly, who we all now depend on to be able to stay home and to
Hmm.
work from home and all of these things.
Yeah.
Um, but like these people are again in many cases not like being put at risk because they're being put on transit services that have been cut back,
Yeah.
um, instead of actually increasing the service to ensure that they can stay safe and they can keep socially distant from each other and all
Exactly.
these different things, right?
Yeah.
um, and so I wonder as well, because there has been talk of density kind of being one
Mm.
of the
Hmm.
problems with coronavirus, right?
Right.
And I saw some numbers recently from China that suggested there was a significant shift from bus and metro use
I
toward
saw
private
that.
car
Yeah.
use in response to the coronavirus.
Hmm.
Um, so I wonder, like you talked about what really we should be doing in response to coronavirus and what we should do after coronavirus to improve transit services. But are you worried that being socially distant, maybe people being scared of being close to other people, will actually, and of course, the oil price being down and gas being so cheap,
Hmm. Hmm.
that there will be a push for even more automobility and kind of these tech solutions to automobility, these autonomous vehicles, electric cars, ride hailing, and all these sorts of things, once we get to the other side of COVID-19? Or do you think there is still, a lot of opportunity to push for better transit services?
I think there's both. I think there is absolutely reason to be concerned that this is a crisis that's going to be exploited by venture capital, by tech capital, as crises have been exploited for many many years. And that's something I try to point out in my book is that the reason that ride hailing services like Uber and Lyft have been able to really capture the public imagination and really materially change conditions on the ground is because in a lot of places transit service is deeply insufficient, and there are real problems with it. And so, the likes of Uber and Lyft have been able to successfully make appeals to affluent people who can afford to rely on ride hailing, and really kind of shift the conversation in that way. So I definitely can see that sort of thing continuing. The idea that Uber and Lyft or autonomous vehicles are intrinsically safer because you're the only one in the vehicle aside from the driver, and you can maintain a social distance by sitting kitty corner from the driver, et cetera, et cetera. Like lots of steps being taken. Um, but to return to the concerns around like harassment and assault on transit, which is something that is a deeply real concern, and it has happened to many women and non-binary and trans people across the world. Is that Uber and Lyft has responded to that and been like, well, look at us, we can guarantee your safety and we can respond to this crisis by offering you this service. And then, of course, what do we find out through Uber's own disclosures is that thousands and thousands of people have been subjected to harassment and assault in these environments as well, and there is very little accountability or transparency, and Uber has taken steps to really try to minimize the amount of liability that they're exposed to, because of course they claim that they're just they're just a matchmaker, so to speak, between the rider and the driver. And so looking at an instance like that, we can see very clearly that this is really a marketing ploy. That they'll say we're safer, but there is really no guarantee of that whatsoever. But that isn't necessarily the point. We're not really dealing in the realm of factual or evidence-based arguments. If we were, buses and trains would be dominating our streets because,
Yeah.
as Jared Walker always tries to point out, transportation is a issue of geometry, and there's just not enough space in cities. So that's really not the conversation that we're having. It's about appealing to people's fears. A lot of these fears can be deeply racist, deeply classist, exaggerating fears that already exist in terms of people's willingness or lack thereof to take transit in many major American cities, and some Canadian cities as well. Is this idea that transit is something that and these are not words that I would use, but this is transportation that poor people use, or transportation that's homeless people use, or these kind of things. And so there's already the stigma which is produced under conditions of austerity once again. And so to point to the second part of your question about the opportunity absolutely still remains. There are some really strong transit rider organizations across North America. TTC Riders in Toronto comes to mind, and organizations that have been doing really effective work in collaboration with transit unions, whether it be ATU or other transportation unions. And so there's a lot of opportunity within that, but of course there's opportunity in many, many different sectors of society. And at this point, it's kind of scary at how quickly things are progressing towards the scenario that is kind of like the worst case or close to the worst case. So I tried to strike that balance in the book itself in terms of tone. Like, things are really bad in terms of transit. I started by talking about the declining ridership over the past several years. Um, and there's no use denying the fact that many transit agencies are deeply in trouble. But out of that, we can also come up with a better analysis of why that is the case. It's not because transit is inferior. It's not because people don't want to ride transit. It's because good transit service isn't being provided, and when it is being provided, it's often to the tech hubs. It's often used as a means of appealing to capital to come invest in the city. And so when it's done with that intention, it often really undermines the case for transit that we should be making, which is that this is infrastructure, it's service that has the potential to be liberatory for everyone. It offers a potential for really great unionized work. It has a potential for really radical climate action. Has the potential for improved accessibility for people with disabilities and seniors. And I'm basically like listing the fundamental argument of my book here, but that it ultimately is a potential at this point. And in order to translate it from a potential into an actuality, we need to struggle for it. And so that's where the opportunity is that we're in a moment of crisis, and if we organize, we can win those. But if we don't, if we sit on the sidelines and only appeal to fact-based responses, as important as those are, that's what most of my book is arguing on the merits of facts. But if that's all that we do, we will likely continue to lose, and transit service will likely continue to suffer as a result. So I don't know if that strikes the adequately optimistic, pessimistic analysis, but that's what I'm kind of hoping for.
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
I think that's like a fantastic point, right? Because we see that in the cities where local municipal governments are willing to really invest in transit, really expand services, really make bus services better, streetcars,
Hmm.
metros, all those sorts of things. Like the ridership does tend to go up, right? We see
Yeah.
that in Vancouver, in Seattle, where they've made major investments in transit
Hmm.
services. The ridership has increased as well. And of
Hmm.
course, in Vancouver, at least until recently, the transit service didn't even have to compete with Uber. So,
That's right.
that wasn't there to take away the ridership, as so many studies show that Uber does. And of
Hmm.
course, you touched on Uber and ride hailing, and how it very much serves often a more privileged group of people,
Hmm.
even though a lot of their marketing suggests that they serve everyone in the community,
For
and
sure.
it's very egalitarian, right?
Hmm.
But all we need to do is look at the studies that are done, which show that the people who use Uber are predominantly young, college educated,
Hmm.
urban and earning above $75,000 a year in the
That's
United
very good.
States or
Yeah.
above $100,000 Canadian a year in
Hmm.
Toronto, right?
Hmm.
So we can see that the people who are benefiting most from this service are people who are relatively well off, whereas the impacts of services like Uber
Hmm.
is are to um, like increase congestion, take people away from transit services, and so it actually negatively impacts the transit services and sort of the transportation options that are
Hmm.
available to lower income people
Hmm.
um, in communities, right?
Absolutely.
But I I think one of the valuable pieces of your book is that you go through these arguments, you go through like the facts on ride hailing. You're not just making some ideological argument, some like
Right,
cultural
right.
Marxist argument or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. um,
Totally.
so so we really get that, and it's really important. And I would like you to also touch on, because you mentioned climate, and
Mm-hmm.
climate is a huge part of this, and there's a lot of comparisons being made toward how we like completely changed our economy overnight to
Hmm.
respond to coronavirus. Like we shut everything down. It looks like it's going to be shut down for a while to come, and
Hmm.
we've been told for years that we can't do anything like that to respond to climate change, right?
Totally.
Um, so not only now are a lot of cars off the road, so we have this opportunity to really decide how we respond to um, coronavirus, like how we form our transportation systems when
Hmm.
um, coronavirus is over and when we can kind of go outside again.
Hmm.
Um, and we can decide whether we just unleash the automobiles again or put a lot of transit in its place and reduce the space for automobiles.
Hmm.
Um, but it also presents us this opportunity to really kind of think about what the economy should look like and whether we should really start to respond to this climate crisis, whether we should bail out the oil industry or
Hmm.
whether we should respond with a Green New Deal or some sort of massive action, right?
Hmm.
And one of the biggest sources of emissions in our societies is transportation.
Yep.
Um, and we're often told that electric cars are the solution to reducing those emissions, because as soon as you cut off the tailpipe, everything is solved, right? The
Hmm.
tailpipe emissions.
Hmm.
Um, but in your book, you explain how it's not as easy as that. So, could you talk about why electric cars are not so much our solution to this problem?
Hmm.
What the potential issues with that are, and why transit is like the better alternative?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important in this kind of conversation to always start with acknowledging the merits of electric vehicles, because there is absolutely a reason why people have tended towards them as a solution. And in terms of like radically increasing the efficiency of the motor itself. Like internal combustion engines are just, hideously inefficient in terms of how much of the energy gets translated into the momentum, propelling the vehicle itself. Electric motors are very, very efficient. They use energy way more effectively than gasoline or diesel powered, and so that's definitely a merit. It reduces air pollution from the engine itself. It's quieter. You can charge it at home. There's all these kind of benefits which I think we have to acknowledge up
Of
front.
course,
They're real, but at the same time, we have to compare it to what is the potential, politics and benefits of transit as a comparison. So one thing I know that you've written about, and that I touch on in the book is, and this, it's a tricky line, because it's a line that is harnessed by the right wing to dismiss any advances in climate policy. But there is a kernel of truth in it, is in terms of the sheer impacts on resources. So the amount of mining that has to scale up in order to actually support everyone having a very large battery in their vehicle. And there is this battery size race going on, because of course there's fears about your car running out. If you're going to the grocery store and then you're stranded, and then so in response, some
often unfounded fears, of course, right?
oh yeah, yeah,
Like,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, yeah, and this is propagated by the right wing lobby that obviously has investments in maintaining fossil fuel status quo. But companies like Tesla have responded by just creating really, really gigantic batteries, which you can drive for hundreds and hundreds of miles at a time. And these require a mass amount of resources. And so I spoke with Theorio Francos, who's a prof in the US, and she's done a lot of really, really excellent work around lithium mining and what that looks like in the lithium triangle in South America. And it's already having really devastating impacts on the watersheds, on the indigenous land use, and all these sorts of things. And of course, we can always claim that there's some tech solution coming off in the near future that will render that obsolete or whatever. But frankly, it's not here, and we have to make decisions on the technologies that we have available at this time, because that's a popular way of kind of dismissing and undermining critique is and this isn't just in transportation, it's everywhere. Is we see it in the oil sands. Is oh, we've got a solution coming off in 10 years to tailings wastes. We'll clean it all up, no problem. But we never actually see that actualize.
Elon Musk is definitely going to solve this for us. I know it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So the resource materials are a huge part, and of course, transit uses electric vehicles uses in transit also relies on batteries. But the argument that I find quite compelling is that the better integrated, the better planned your transit system is, the lower the resource demand will be. And so if we look at the use of streetcars or trolley buses, if they do need batteries at all, they're very small batteries. And these are basically, in the case of trolley buses, it's for when they go off wire. And so, you can look in Vancouver with the trolley buses is that they are predominantly linked to the wires, but if for whatever reason the plan requires them to go off wire, they rely on the small battery, and then once they relink, they can recharge. And so that's a far smaller battery, propelling a far greater number of people than a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf or whatnot. And that kind of gets to the broader point around sheer efficiency of transit as a mode, is that the fact that you can fit 40 to 60 people on a pretty regular sized bus. Of course, if we're trying to deal with overcrowding, maybe it would be on the lower end of that. Is that it's far more efficient on a per passenger per kilometer ratio than it is if you're putting 1 to 2 or even 5 people in a Tesla. And the idea that 5 people are going to be riding in a Tesla is not borne out by any of the evidence of the push for carpooling over the last several decades as kind of a solution to gasoline consumption. And so that would be another point for me, is just that the potential in the transit mode, if it is properly funded and if there is really good service, is a lot bigger, and it's a lot more efficient than if we make a push to electric vehicles. And I mean, I could go on this like all day, but I think the final point I'll make at the moment is that electric vehicles maintain many of the negative impacts of automobility that we currently see today. And so, yes, it reduces tailpipe emissions. Yes, it reduces air pollution from the engine. But in the case of environmental impacts, it maintains air pollution from the tires and from the brakes. And yes, there's regenerative braking, so there's an argument against that. But from the tires themselves, there's a huge amount of air pollution that is created from that often ends up in watersheds or in the ocean itself, and the microplastics and all that kind of thing. But in terms of other impacts of automobility, there is a lot of automobile related inequality. And so the amount of money that you have to shell out for a new or even gently used automobile is quite a lot. And I don't think advocates of electric vehicles necessarily factor that in, because the way that they look at these things is it's a sensible purchase. It's going to pay off over a decade or 2 decades, because the amount of money that you spend on actually powering the car is far less than.
You can use it as a robo taxi.
Yeah, you can use it as a robo taxi. You can store electricity over it overnight, and then feed it back into the grid for a benefit. All these kind of things. But for a lot of people who are facing deep transportation inequalities today, that doesn't resolve anything, even with very generous state subsidies for electric vehicles. And so there is, it's kind of like an elite projection in terms of what's possible for everyone to use. And of course, the more people who we have using electric vehicles, the more batteries we need to produce, and the more impacts it has on communities where these minerals and metals are mined. And then there's also the spatial inefficiencies, the fact that we just simply don't have enough space in cities for everyone to have an electric vehicle. The fact that transit is an inherently more efficient service in terms of emissions, but also just in terms of the amount of space that it uses. There's that famous meme where you have 40, I think it's 40 or 60 cars, and it just fills up the entire screen up to the horizon. And then there's one bus, and then there's like a small pocket of cyclists, and they all represent the same number of people, right? So that's a pretty intuitive way to look at that problem. I could continue to kind of give examples of why electric vehicles are not the future we should be advocating for, but I think the way that it's been talked about, even on the electoral left, has been kind of disappointing. Is that we often see electric vehicles posited as something that can be proliferated alongside transit. An argument that I try to make in my book is that, like, really we have to be thinking about this as an either or. And I know people will criticize that or say that that's overly reductionist or whatever. But every private automobile that is on the road is slowing down everyone else, including transit. And you see that every time you take transit in Winnipeg, which is where I am, is that the reason that the buses are so slow, the reason that they're so late, the reason that you can't rely on them is because they get clogged up in cars. And the simple solution to that is taking space away from cars. So that means dedicated lanes. We've seen successes on this in the streetcar line in Toronto and the rapid transit in New York City. Is that we need to physically be removing vehicles from the road and replacing that with really, really high quality transit. So that's like another reason why I kind of push back against the idea of electric vehicles, is that, like, is making transit worse. Every time someone buys an electric vehicle, it's a potential transit rider who is going to be opting to drive their electric vehicle for the foreseeable future, and that's a great concern to me. And I think it should be to more people on the left, generally speaking. Is that we really need to double down on, double down, triple down, quadruple down on transit, on active transportation, which includes quality pedestrian infrastructure, cycling, all these kind of things, to really knit a city together in a way which not only gives people the option to take transit, but makes it greatly preferable because it's far more affordable, it's far more enjoyable, and you can count on getting from one place to the other far more efficiently, and far lower emissions as well. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, but those are fantastic points, right? Like, I think the equity question is a really big one, um, because I read this study out of the Nordic countries, and
Hmm.
obviously Norway is one of these countries that has a really high penetration of electric vehicles,
Absolutely.
and even the experts over there were saying, like, we're really concerned that we're subsidizing electric vehicles, but that subsidy is primarily going to higher income individuals. Whereas if we
Hmm.
had put that subsidy into transit services, you know, the benefits would accrue more to lower income people and the people who actually need those subsidies, not
Yeah.
higher income people who can afford these vehicles anyway and are often buying them as like secondary vehicles and not really taking advantage of them in the way that they should, right?
Well, yeah, and we've seen the same thing in the States, is that the subsidies are primarily going to higher income households. And one of the interesting things that one study has found is that many of the switches that are happening are from fairly efficient hybrid vehicles to electric vehicles, and so the relative improvement from an emissions point of view is quite low. But we also have to just like think about, okay, what does it mean that a single family or even an individual is getting, say, a $5,000 subsidy from the state for their electric vehicle, which is likely going to only benefit them. Maybe if they have a partner and kids, maybe that's two or three people, but on a pretty regular basis, we're talking about a $5,000 subsidy for 1 to 2 people. And think of what that could do if we kind of accumulated all of those and invested that into transit, and even beyond that point, just the idea that we're really encouraging more automobility, which once again is making every other mode of transportation less efficient and less viable. So yeah, we're seeing that happen in the U.S. and Canada, pretty much everywhere where these kind of subsidies are being implemented.
Yeah, of course. And like you said, often we see left-wing parties, especially in North America, or center-left parties marginally, um, who present these environmental plans, but when it comes to transportation, the focus is so often on electric vehicles, right?
For
Instead
sure.
of on expanding transit.
Yeah.
And it was actually you who brought the trolley bus, the electric trolley bus, to my attention because I was like, wow, like obviously buses are much better than electric cars, like electric buses.
Yeah.
But then if you can implement trolley buses, especially around the denser parts of the city, then that further reduces the resources that you need to extract and the batteries that you need
Hmm.
in order to make the city run, right? So you're cutting out
Hmm.
the emissions, assuming that you're using renewable energies and not fossil fuel energy production in
For
order to
sure.
run the system. But even
Yeah.
then, it would be more efficient, as you say, because those batteries are more efficient and what have you.
Yeah.
Um, but like it would be a significant benefit if we can switch toward using trolley buses instead of just like the larger scale electric buses, right?
Yeah, and I should make just a very brief intervention that like even if we're only using diesel buses or compressed natural gas buses or whatever the city's fleet is, getting way more people onto those buses is just an inherent climate solution. We have the infrastructure in place, and if we improve service, if we hire more good unionized drivers, and if we just make sure that this has like really continuous service throughout the day and the night, we will see just a major improvement in emissions. And this is something that we saw in the last federal election in Canada. Was that when transit was brought up, it was often okay. We need electric buses, and of course, I'd be like, no, 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 we need trolley buses. But like ultimately, it's like no, we just need improved transit service. Like commit to federal funding of transit service, and hopefully reduce or abolish fares along the way, and that will just radically improve transit ridership, and that in itself is a climate policy. I think over time, over the next 5-10 years, as these older buses begin to be retired, whether it's just because of age or also because of a desire for cleaner and quieter buses, we can switch towards these newer modes. But yeah, I just wanted to make the point that like even given the existing fleet of transit infrastructure that we have, getting more people onto that is in itself a climate solution.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. Now, I have one final question for you.
Of
Um,
course.
Often when we present transit and kind of like these larger reimaginings of what the city could look like, there's pushback, right? Because people are used to a certain way of building the city and of living in the city. And I often think about how Mark Fisher wrote about this concept of capitalist realism, right? This notion that it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism, or sorry, it's easy to imagine the end of the world
I
than
wish.
the end of capital. Exactly,
Yeah.
right? Um, yeah. So, like, I think about that notion, and I think like there almost seems to be something similar with automobility, right? We have this system of automobility. We have these cities that are dominated by cars, and it can be really difficult for people to imagine like what their life is going to look like
Hmm.
in that kind of alternative system, you
Yeah.
know. And in your book you write that transit success is a virtuous cycle. It can
Hmm.
it can be difficult for people to imagine the benefits of a dedicated bus lane or an all-door boarding system until it's implemented. And every small success is a step in that direction. And I think Toronto's dedicated King Street pilot project for streetcars was kind of an example of that, right? And we're sort of seeing the same thing now in the United States with, I think, is the 14th Street busway in New York City and Market Street being closed to cars in San Francisco. So I'm wondering, how do we kind of change people's mind and make them kind of wake up to the benefits that transit could have in their lives, and in the lives of the people around them as well? And what is kind of the way that we fight to get this kind of agenda implemented, when there is still so much pushback, like on a political level?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously it's like the most important question kind of that we're facing. I have a few scattered ideas. The first one is the promise of fare-free transit, and I know that transit wonks will hear that and just groan because they're like, "Oh, this is just a fake solution." But the reason that I find it extremely appealing as a struggle is because it gives people a really intuitive sense that the interaction that they're having is with a public service, and it's a collective service as opposed to something that you pay for as a user fee. And some people who ride transit do see it as that, but that tends to be people who tend to be a bit more well off and can celebrate transit systems of different kinds around the world. And we did actually see that in Winnipeg last year. There was a very protracted, very brutal standoff between the union and the transit agency over some very, very moderate demands from the union, like just having slightly extended, bathroom breaks for drivers and these kind of things. And the union took inspiration from some actions that had been taken by the transit unions in Japan and also in Australia. I think it was Brisbane, was that they basically declared fare free days, and it was kind of like it was an interesting thing to see unfold because they simply didn't enforce it. So they didn't inform people that they didn't have to pay, but they didn't enforce it when people didn't. And so there was this movement that was kind of encouraged by the union and also by supporters, was just informing people the fact that, okay, on this day you don't have to pay. And this is purely anecdotal, but I know that when I took the bus that day, and I did have conversations with other people who took the bus that day, was it felt like a radically different experience of riding the bus. And of course, that doesn't improve service. That doesn't mean that your bus is going to show up on time or show up ever. But I think that's a starting point, is really redefining transit as a public service. And linked to that is really pushing back against what we see, very racist and white supremacist fare enforcement in places like New York City, Toronto. We've seen actions take place around the world where there's these organized fare hopping. There's also organized reporting of when transit cops show up. And so to link those struggles together, to say by abolishing fares, we are improving the sense of one's participation in a collective society. We are fighting back against racist policing, which will often end in very large fines or incarceration. And then also it protects transit workers. And this is like a really big point that I try to make again and again, is that there was an internal survey done of drivers across North America by ATU, and they found overwhelmingly that assault or harassment of drivers is overwhelmingly caused by fare disputes. And this isn't to say that you eliminate fares and there's going to be no issues at all for drivers. Any driver will tell you that that is not true. But the fact that someone comes on and they are having a hard day for whatever reason, whether they're dealing with traumas or mental health or substance use or whatever it may be, and then you combine that with an altercation caused over fares, and that can be very dangerous for drivers, and drivers should not be put in that position. So that's another argument that I'd make for fare free. And I know um, the transit needs to be much more democratic and needs to be understood as part of a collective struggle on many, many fronts against austerity, against capitalism, and against privatization. And this is something that I don't think transit advocates have really pointed out too much. And I think in part that is because they don't see this as much of a problem. I think they see oftentimes any transit infrastructure being constructed as an inherently good thing. But I think the privatization of transit, which in itself is linked to ongoing austerity and the downloading of fiscal responsibility for building these kind of services on municipalities or counties or that kind of thing. It really, really creates a lot of resentment among potential transit riders. And there's a whole bunch of complicated reasons for this. I won't get into at the moment, but we've seen this play out in the UK. We've seen how buses and trains have become wildly more expensive. Their service has been slashed. The quality of service has declined. And the actual routes that are serviced tend to be the ones that benefit or are used by affluent people. Because if private capital is behind this, then the interest is to generate as much profit as possible, which tends to be servicing more affluent people. So yeah, we've seen this in with Metrolinx in Toronto, which is a very bizarre organization, which is like kind of quasi privatized, but they are getting pretty big money from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was established to attract private capital, including from the likes of SNC-Lavalin, which itself completely botched the construction of the Ottawa LRT, as we're seeing again and again and again. So what this can do is have the reverse effect, is that you have an entire demographic of potential transit riders who see this kind of thing unfold, and they're like, okay, so SNC-Lavalin and the consortium behind that, I believe they're called Rideau Transit Group, decided for one of the for the LRT stations to use a very low quality material for the steps. And so what that meant is that as soon as it snowed, as soon as moisture got on the steps, people began slipping. So they're basically risking breaking bones or severely injuring themselves just trying to get onto an LRT. And that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of problems with the Ottawa LRT. But people will have these experiences of transit privatization and then kind of write off transit as a whole as a result. So that's part of what we have to fight. And some ATU locals and other transit unions have been fighting against that, especially Doug Ford's attempt to upload the subway to the province and then presumably package that off for privatization. And related to that is just the need to make this a real struggle, which is connected to many other struggles. So struggles for public housing, struggles for better healthcare, struggles for childcare, and access to education, and all these kind of things. And so to really position it as part of a broader liberatory struggle, because I think if we, this is coming from someone who just wrote an entire book about transit, but I think if we fixate too much on transit, we can run into some issues in the sense that we just accept any transit project as an inherently good one. And I think we've seen many examples of why that's not true. We can see Elon Musk, trying to make his stabs at what he calls transit, which is clearly not transit, and some city officials in Chicago and elsewhere will embrace that, even though they have a perfectly functional blue line to the airport. And so we really need to be careful about the kind of transit projects that we push for. For example, it's not just about ridership; it's also about quality of service for existing riders. So in Winnipeg's North End, which is predominantly Indigenous and predominantly low income, that entire area of the city is very, very neglected by service. And there's technically transit service, but it's very, very poor in terms of its efficiency and its timeliness and all the rest. And so I think really working to fight with those communities for better transit service and not do this top down, okay, you're having this and this is going to be good for you, because that can really lead to negative outcomes. With that said, and this is something that I've been somewhat inspired by, is the idea, and this is a complicated one also, but just taking space for transit and for pedestrians and for cyclists, I think can be really effective. And I would be fascinated to see how this would pan out in Winnipeg. But for example, because of COVID, they have shut down a number of streets for pedestrians, cyclists, scooters, whatever. And this has happened in a number of other cities too. And it's kind of incredible just to walk on these streets. And I've experienced this feeling in protests before, where rallies and marches have taken the street before. Is that you'll be in the middle of Winnipeg, in the middle of Portage and Main. You've got banks on all four corners and everything. And you look around and you're like, this is a you have the kind of same experience as riding fare free, is that you have this radical kind of like internal shift of what life could be like. I think that can be a very powerful thing. And so there's these I believe they're called tactical bus lanes. These ideas that you take a lane that exists on the road and you paint it red or whatever color, and then you say this is going to be for buses or bikes or whatever only. And then you do that for a month, you do that for 3 months, you see how it goes. And this, of course, has to be in deep conversation with the people who are most effective, because when they do bus network redesigns, there can often be hostility towards that, because people who have come to rely on a certain type of bus service and see that radically changed overnight without what they consider to be proper consultation can lead to some really negative outcomes. So I think even if you're doing a surprise tactical bus lane, you need to do it very as carefully as you can, but you also need to be prepared for the backlash from the people who have the most power, which is the business lobby, and which is the affluent people who can afford to drive to the suburbs. Um, and so I think like it needs to be done as part of this understanding of class struggle, that that transit is something that is serving the working class, that it is itself a working class project because of the fact that these unionized drivers are, and not just drivers, but cleaners and administrators and all the rest are behind this. And then the final point I'll make, and I'm sorry for going on about this, but is understanding transit as not just an urban issue, but a inner city, a rural, and a national issue. And so really try to connect it together as a transportation system. So this idea that I could take the train in an efficient way to Vancouver, which is not a possibility at the moment, but which is just like ludicrous given how big Canada is, and how proud it is of its you know transnational infrastructure, which is basically a highway at this point. But also really working to radically improve transit service in rural areas, because rural areas tend to be older. There tend to be more people with disabilities, and depending on where you're looking at, they tend to be heavily racialized. So in the deep south of the U.S., there's a lot of black communities. But this is also in Nova Scotia. Like rural Nova Scotia has there's Black communities there which are just like not served at all by transit service. And so I think really advocating for transit as part of this broader network, this broader struggle, which can interlink all sorts of issues. Like when the STC was closed down in Saskatchewan, what we saw was people, overwhelmingly like Indigenous people were unable to get to medical appointments in the city. You had people with disabilities who were no longer able to see their family or friends, and so they were just sent into this isolation. For seniors, once again, no longer able to get to medical appointments or get to the grocery store or like these kind of things. And so to really, really focus in on what did exist, which was the SDC. It was a Crown Corp. It was extremely effective. And also look at like Greyhound, which recently pulled out of Western Canada, and Greyhound was not a great service, but it contained the seed of what would be a great service if it was nationally coordinated. And so I know that that was a bit of a rambling explanation of where we should look to, but I think if we combine fare free, if we combine an anti-privatization and pro-democracy, if we combine that with trying to take space from automobiles in a way which is deeply democratic and deeply rooted in other liberatory struggles, and finally rooting that with just the sense that this is a national, and national is not a great word given how related it is to nationalist sentiments. Um, so maybe a global project instead, like just this idea that we can really struggle collectively for better transit service that can connect all of us, that can improve our lives, that can improve our ability to see family and friends and to experience leisure and to experience pleasure, as well as just getting us to jobs in a way and these jobs are hopefully, tied to socially beneficial projects as well. So I'll leave it at that for now, but those are a couple of my stray thoughts that I've come up with over the past while.
No, I think that's a great place to leave it because it shows us how not only are our transportation systems linked, whether they are within a city, within the broader urban area, in the national context and in the global context, like these are all linked and they allow people to get where they need to go, but also our struggles for a better world and for better cities and to rectify all of these problems that we face are also connected, right?
Absolutely.
Just the same as our lives are connected, just which we're seeing right now more than ever with COVID-19 and how essential some of the people who we often regard as inessential really are to our lives, right?
Absolutely.
So before I let you go, I do want to ask you one more thing.
For sure.
Is there a book that stands out that has really been instructive to your thinking around transportation?
Yeah. In the introduction to the book itself, I laid out some assumptions that I make throughout the book, just to make clear to the reader where I'm coming from. And one was Mimi Scheller's Mobility Justice.
I love
So
that book.
she's a sociology prof at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and it's just a really tightly written book, which makes the argument that which is kind of it. I've reflected my own argument from her is that we just really need to be thinking of mobility as a much bigger issue than just getting from A to B. So this is on the micro level. She looks at gender oppression in transportation, and also the individual experience of a migrant or of a person with a disability, or a racialized person, but spanning that all the way up to how we think of mobility when it comes to climate change, when it comes to migration as on a demographic level, all these kind of things. And so I found her work really good, and I really encourage people to check that book out. I think it's from Verso Books. Really, really recommended.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, James. Thanks for chatting. It's been really enlightening, and hopefully everyone will go fight for better transit in their cities
Absolutely.
now.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me, Paris. Just last point is your work has been a huge inspiration to mine, and I relied on your a lot of your arguments and a lot of the research that you've done for the book itself. And so thank you for the work that you do as well.
Thank you so much.
For sure.
Talk to you again soon.
Okay, see ya.
James Wilt is the author of Do Androids Dream of Electric Cars? Public Transit in the Age of Google, Uber, and Elon Musk. It was published by Between the Lines Books, and you can buy it at btlbooks.com, hopefully from your local independent bookstore or library, and anywhere else that books are sold. Make sure to leave a review of Tech Won't Save Us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Tech Won't Save Us. You can follow me on Twitter at ParisMarx, and you can follow James Wilt at James_M_Wilt. Thanks for listening.